The 15th century was a century of change. The Renaissance movement, which started in Italy, brought about an artistic and intellectual revolution. Ideas developed in famous Italian cities like Florence, Milan, and Pisa quickly spread throughout Europe. Among these ideas, some were dangerous, and they were expressed more vehemently with each passing day. The spark of the Reformation movement, which would begin in the first quarter of the next century, had slowly started to ignite. Eventually, with the voyages led by European explorers in the middle of this changing era, an unprecedented period in world history opened its doors. Soon it was understood that the world was much larger than previously thought, and there were many lands waiting to be seized in this new world. The political and economic crisis in continental Europe led European states to turn to overseas territories. Countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, England, Spain, France, and Portugal established colonies and territories, primarily in the Americas. The New World was rich in fertile lands and valuable minerals, but migration from Europe was not sufficient to ensure development and increased production in the region. More manpower was needed. Initially, the indigenous peoples were used as slave labor. However, due to the harsh working conditions and the diseases brought by Europeans to America, a significant portion of them soon lost their lives. The system called indentured servitude was also not sufficient to meet the need. Eventually, European traders resorted to one of the oldest practices in human history, slavery, and, for this purpose, turned their sails to the coasts of West Africa. The first country to officially start African slave trade was Portugal. They began buying and selling slaves in Ghana from 1441 for use in the mines. Between 1500 and 1535, about 10,000 slave transactions took place. Over time, the Spaniards also became interested in the slave trade. However, due to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between Portugal and Spain, giving Portugal dominance over the African coasts, Spanish traders could not be as active in this area as the Portuguese. Initially, slaves were transported to Seville in Spain or the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. Starting from 1525, they began to be transported from São Tomé off the coast of Africa to Hispaniola in the Caribbean. From 1642 onwards, the Dutch spread their slave trade activities to other regions of Africa. During these years, private companies in England were already involved in the slave trade. Particularly, London, Bristol, and Liverpool became important ports in the slave trade. Between 1695 and 1807, the ships that set sail from Liverpool for the purpose of slave trading numbered 5,300, 3,100 from London, and 2,200 from Bristol. In contrast, during the same period, only 450 ships set sail from other ports in Europe to go to Africa. In the early 1700s, most British slave traders were from London and Bristol. However, from the 1730s onwards, the dominance in this field shifted to Liverpool merchants, and they continued to maintain this superiority until the early 19th century. By 1807, when the slave trade was banned, Liverpool led the ports involved in this trade. Atlantic slave trade consisted of 3 separate stages, known by historians as the triangular trade or slave trade triangle. The first stage involved the export of certain goods produced in Europe to Africa. Ships departing from European ports carried processed goods such as weapons, ammunition, alcohol, textiles, and cookware to the west coast of Africa. These were generally low-quality products collected from second-hand markets. The goods were sold at favorable prices to African kings supporting the slave trade or used in the slave trade. With the disposal of processed goods loaded in Europe, the first leg of the triangular trade was completed. The next stage was the Middle Passage, where slaves obtained from Africa were loaded onto ships and transported to the Caribbean or the American continent. Local slave traders, often employing armed gangs, would collect black slaves from inland areas. Additionally, Conflicts among African tribes were another factor that kept the slave trade alive. The tribe that emerged victorious in the conflict would sell the defeated side as slaves to slave traders. The most frequented slave markets for ships departing from Europe were the region between Senegal and Angola on the southwest coast of Africa. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, the main centers of the slave trade were Senegambia, Upper Guinea, Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Benin Gulf, Biafra Gulf, Congo, and Angola. Traders typically paid around 3 to 4 pounds for a purchased slave on the African coasts. In contrast, the selling price of slaves in America ranged from 25 pounds to 30 pounds. The most profitable stage of the journey was this second stage, known as the Middle Passage, but this was not enough for European traders. Therefore, in the third leg of the journey, ships carried sugar, rum, tobacco, timber, and cotton from America and the Caribbean to Europe. Although the transportation of slaves was not widespread in this stage in the 18th century, when it became fashionable for wealthy individuals in England to have at least one black slave in their mansions, ships began to carry slaves, albeit occasionally, in this stage of the journey. When the ships arriving from America docked at European ports, the triangular trade was completed. The second stage, Middle Passage transatlantic slave trade, largely occurred during the second stage known as the Middle Passage. Ships belonging to companies involved in this trade varied greatly in size. In the early days of the slave trade around the 15th century, ships carrying goods to the Americas and the West Indies had compartments for 20 to 30 slaves. By the 17th century, the largest slave ships had a capacity to carry 400 slaves. However, the conditions were terrible. Before being reported to the ships, the slaves were fed one last time and loaded onto the ships with chains on their feet. The area allocated for each individual in the cargo section was less than half a square meter. To understand how small this area was, you can imagine the pillows you use at night. The standard size of these pillows is slightly smaller than half a square meter. This is where the slaves slept, ate, and spent most of their journey. Additionally, the height of the cargo section rarely exceeded half a meter. Therefore, the slaves had to complete the journey by lying down or squatting. During the day, under the supervision of doctors, they were brought to the deck in rows to receive necessary daylight exposure. They were given 2 meals a day, and their nutrition was controlled. It was not desired for them to go hungry, weaken, or get sick. If the weather conditions were suitable, the Middle Passage was completed in an average of about 45 days. However, if the weather conditions were unfavorable, the journey could last more than 2 months. Therefore, food restrictions were applied on ships, and the number or quantity of meals was reduced. However, there were instances of even worse practices. In 1781, a captain facing food and water shortages threw 136 slaves into the sea in an attempt to solve this problem. Female and child slaves were transported in a separate section from men. It was forbidden for women to have sexual relations with the crew, but records indicate that this rule was violated many times. The slaves brought to the colonies were used in mining and agricultural fields, as well as in various other areas, including housework, construction, and manual labor. Among the countries extensively involved in the slave trade were England, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. Of the slaves brought from Africa, 40% worked in the Caribbean, 38% in Brazil, 17% in Spanish America, and 6% in North America. The number of slaves brought from the African coasts to the plantations in America increased every year. Before 1580, the number of slaves brought from Africa to the colonies was around 68,000. Between 1580 and 1640, this number reached 607,000, and between 1640 and 1700, it reached 829,000. Between 1700 and 1760, the slaves brought from Africa to America reached 2,846,000. During the African slave trade, around 11,700,000 Africans were forcibly taken from their countries and loaded onto ships. Of these, approximately 9,700,000 managed to reach the other side of the Atlantic. The remaining 2 million people became victims of these greed-driven voyages that lasted for 3 centuries, like their lifeless bodies thrown into the deep waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Their names and stories, like their lifeless bodies thrown into the deep waters of the Atlantic Ocean, disappeared. Europeans were generally unaware of the conditions in America and Africa. Especially in England, slaves employed in mansions were treated very well. Slave traders like Edward Colston and Foster Cunliffe were known as benevolent citizens in their countries. When they died, the pedestals under the statues erected in their honor told stories of the philanthropy they had done throughout their lives. However, it did not take long for the public to learn the truth. Campaigns to abolish slavery were launched in England from the 1770s. Anti-slavery propaganda in Britain was largely led by Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce. Moral, religious, and humane arguments gained more and more supporters. And finally, the slave trade was banned in 1807 in England and the United States, in 1814 in the Netherlands, in 1815 in France, and in subsequent years in other European countries. However, these bans covered the sale of slaves, not slavery itself. And it would take many years for the slaves working on plantations in the colonies to gain their freedom. Despite all this, explaining the abolition of slavery solely through radical anti-slavery movements is not possible. The Atlantic slave trade was initiated to meet the need for human labor to work in plantations and mines in the West Indies or the American continent. The main factor in its termination or substantial reduction was that this need for human labor had now disappeared. The Industrial Revolution provided new opportunities and prospects for European traders and the bourgeoisie. In 1790, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a device that separated the seed from the cotton fiber. This machine produced 50 times more cotton in a day than a plantation slave could produce. Over time, new inventions and innovations like these replaced slaves on plantations. In other words, the main factor in the abolition of slavery was not moral, religious, or humane, but economic and practical. Throughout human history, slavery has been accepted and practiced by many civilizations. Some of these civilizations legally allowed slavery under harsh conditions, while others tried to improve slavery laws to ensure the continuity of the system. However, the Atlantic slave trade was much more severe and cruel than other types of slavery seen throughout history. Ships embarking on transoceanic journeys left behind millions of corpses and transported millions more to plantations in the New World to spend their lives in poor conditions. This era of hopelessness and greed-driven voyages continued for a full 3 centuries. The developments and anti-slavery movements of the 18th and 19th centuries finally closed this shameful chapter. However, the traces will continue to be seen forever in the history of mankind. Whether we learn the necessary lessons from these traces is up to us. Until the next video,